Hello, today on Tough Questions we're going to be looking at the issue of abortion. What should our response to abortion be as a Christian, and what would Jesus have us do? Before we get started, it's important to acknowledge that many people will find this subject difficult for lots of different reasons. The aim of this teaching is not to provide a cut and dried answer, but to allow us to explore the issues so that we can come to an informed decision for ourselves. It's also not our job to judge other people who hold a different view or to criticise someone who has made decisions in the past either to or not to have an abortion. And also, if you are struggling with issues and need to speak to someone who can offer some specialist advice and help, I've put some resources in the description to the film. And of course, I would always advise speaking in confidence to your local church priest or pastor for spiritual help. It's also worth saying that the best time to explore this issue is when it's not relevant to you. What I mean is that trying to come to a decision on such a difficult topic when you or someone you love is facing an unwanted pregnancy is perhaps a little late. So it's good for us as Christians to explore the tough questions of life and not to shy away from them. Tough questions such as issues around abortion. On some levels, the question about abortion is quite simple, but anyone who has looked into it will know that it's actually far from simple. On the one hand, we're taught as Christians, you shall not murder. It's the 6th commandment, so abortion must be wrong. Right? Well, if only it were that simple. The 6th commandment does indeed tell us you shall not murder. The Cambridge English Dictionary defines murder as the crime of intentionally killing a person. An abortion is a definite intentional act. But the key question for us is to define whether we believe a fetus is a person. If so, if a fetus is a person, to intentionally kill is a crime, and if it's not, then it isn't. Or in other words, when does life begin? The Bible has very little to say on the matter of abortion. In fact, it does not explicitly refer to it at all. We do hear God speaking to the prophet Jeremiah, saying, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you." And then in the Psalms it says, "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb." We could therefore argue that because God created humanity in the womb, it is sacred and should not be destroyed. But regardless of what view we take on abortion, all Christians believe that God created us. That much is not up for debate. But equally, God also created the animals, the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and yet lots of Christians are happy to eat meat. Just because God made something does not mean that we cannot have control and dominion over it. In the first chapter of Genesis, God gave to humanity a care for the world. He allowed humanity to partake in the creation of the world. Let's go back to the question of when we believe life begins. You see, if we regard a fetus as just a bunch of cells, yes, with the potential to be a human life, but not yet actually human, then to abort it is not a problem, because it's not yet a living being. So when does life begin? Can we say that life begins once a child is born? In some ways, this is the most straightforward and easy to identify. It's obvious to all concerned when a fetus becomes a child. It's either in the womb or it's outside. There is a clear dividing line. Also, this is the point at which the child can survive without intervention from the mother. They stop being an extension of the mother, fed by her and breathing through her, and they begin to live as an independent human. The problem with believing that life begins at the moment of birth, usually around 38 to 42 weeks of gestation, is that babies are capable of surviving if they are born much earlier. Albeit sometimes only with a great deal of medical intervention, but they can survive nevertheless. Indeed, babies have been known to survive when they were born as early as 21 weeks. This in itself raises a question for us about the number of weeks before which an abortion can be legally performed, which in the UK is 24 weeks. Okay, so can we say that life begins maybe at 21 weeks of gestation, because before that no child has yet survived outside of the womb? The difficulties with this argument is that every fetus develops at a different rate, just as children grow and develop differently. Whereas one fetus might be capable of surviving by a certain number of weeks gestation, others might not. And whilst also children have been known to survive at 21 weeks, it's certainly not the norm. To create a definitive point is hard. So maybe we should say that life begins once the fetus is fully formed. Now, I personally find this particular argument quite dangerous because not all fetuses completely form, and there are many people who are born disabled. And I, for one, cannot say that someone born disabled has any less right to life than someone who is not born disabled. If we argue that life begins once a fetus is fully formed, this opens up a whole new argument about rights to life. And only those who have no form of disability are valued as a human, which is clearly not true. Maybe we could go back even further and say that life begins once a fertilised egg implants into the mother's womb. In lots of ways, this is possibly one of the easier arguments to make. As with the idea of life beginning when a child is born, there is a definitive and obvious distinction between the embryo being implanted and not, although this may not be clear to the mother. The argument against this being seen as when life begins is that for many, many weeks it is still only a bunch of cells. Yes, with the potential to be human, but in no way recognisable as a baby. And of course, without the ability currently to survive in absence of the mother. Some people may go back even further and say that life begins when the egg is fertilised, but before it has implanted into the womb. This would mean that various forms of contraception widely used that prevent the fertilised egg from implanting could technically be seen as forms of abortion. Again, it is possible to go back even further and say that a man's seed and a woman's egg are human life. This would lead us to the conclusion that to have sexual intercourse for any reason other than procreation is wrong. Such teaching has in the past been the norm in some Christian denominations. However, within the Church of England, this is no longer considered correct. A healthy, loving, faithful relationship includes enjoying each other fully, and this includes sexual intercourse for reasons other than procreation. Each of us has to prayerfully weigh the different options and come to form an opinion for ourselves about when we believe life begins. However, even once we make that decision, there is still a further question to be considered, and that is the rights of the mother against the rights of the unborn child. Now, there are not many people who would consider it acceptable to continue with a pregnancy if to do so would endanger the life of the mother, especially if she already has other children to care for. And there are other considerations. For example, a pregnancy that was the result of sexual violence. Whilst in this situation, to continue with the pregnancy might not endanger the mother's physical life, could she really be expected to deal with the emotional trauma of doing so? For many years since abortion became legal in most parts of the UK in the 60s, it has been seen as a way of liberating women and allowing them to have control over their bodies and their lives. And indeed, this has often happened. Women who were not ready to bring up a child because of the interruption to their career or schooling were offered a way out. And of course, we cannot help but mention the alternative backstreet abortion doctors who existed before legalised abortions, who did untold damage to women, sometimes even leading to death. Some would argue that legalising abortions has reduced death because it has saved the lives of the mothers. But do any of these reasons mean that the right of the mother to choose what happens over her body outweighs the rights of the fetus to life? I would like to put forward another argument for us to consider. Firstly, before I go into it, this film is not going to look at the rights or wrongs of sexual relationships outside of marriage. That's beyond the scope of this film and it's subject for another time. But putting that to one side, in the UK we are one of the most advanced medical countries in the world, and access to medical help here is free. Perhaps instead of trying to decide what to do with unwanted pregnancies, we should put our energies into preventing the pregnancies happening in the first place. This takes many forms. For some Christians, it might indeed be teaching that sexual relationships outside of marriage is wrong, although it's worth saying that the church has a long history of teaching this and a long history of children born out of wedlock. It might be taking the form of educating our children on entering into safe relationships and giving them advice on contraception. Indeed, are we even talking to our children about abortion and exploring the issues with them before they fall pregnant? For myself, as a teen, I was given the opportunity to think about how my Christian faith impacted on my feelings around abortion. This in turn then heavily influenced my desire not to get pregnant until I wished it. What about the churches? Are we as churches providing support to women who find themselves unexpectedly pregnant, or do we tut when the single mum brings her children to church? You see, it's all well and good for us to say abortion is wrong, and that may be a good thing to do, but then we can't also condemn mothers who decide to continue with a pregnancy just because it doesn't fit our view of correctness. No, we need to be supporting families, regardless of how that family is comprised. Are we campaigning for better maternity benefits for women and good, affordable childcare to enable them to have children and careers? Do we still consider it strange when the father stays at home to look after the children and the mother goes back to work? Or do we embrace this as a good thing to do? Abortion raises bigger social issues than simply the right for women to end a pregnancy. So where does God stand in all of this? Because the Bible does not explicitly address abortion does not mean that God is quiet on the subject. God is interested in every part of our lives, and God knows the secrets of our hearts. I suspect that there is no one-size-fits-all, no straightforward answer, and each case will be different. God sees when a woman agonizes over ending a pregnancy in order to save her own life, and he also sees when someone is promiscuous, not caring to take precaution because abortion is an easy option available should the worst happen. Each of us have to weigh up the issues here and prayerfully come to a decision on how we feel God is speaking to us on this issue.